This is the Chapter 6 review for World History 2. There is a lot of stuff on this test, a lot of people, a lot of different events, so it's critical that you study. But we'll go through each and every one of these little categories, and I'll try and explain just the simple things you need to know. Starting off in the chapter, we have the scientific revolution, which is the key beginning to this chapter. It's all about observation and measurement. That's what all these scientists and all the astronomers and the physicists and the doctors are doing. They're observing things that they see. They are measuring their observations. And this is what's leading us to the scientific revolution. This is also the first time they're using the scientific method. And what we're seeing in general, because of these two things, is a greater expansion of knowledge. Your key scientists, the first one who's starting it all off is Nicholas Copernicus. He's coming up with the heliocentric theory, which, if you remember, is overriding the old geocentric theory that the world had accepted for 1,500 years, thanks to Ptolemy back here in the Roman Empire. But his idea is the heliocentric theory. The geocentric theory said that the Earth was the center of the universe, the heliocentric theory says that everything revolves around the sun. So the sun is the center of our little solar system. Johann Kepler comes along. The only thing Copernicus got wrong was that he said that the planets orbited in circles. Johann Kepler comes along and he corrects that. He describes planetary motions as moving in ellipses, which are ovals. Galileo comes along to support the two of them. He's using a new tool called the telescope to do his observations and make his measurements. Some of the biggest things that he is observing are the moon, the sun, and then the moons of Jupiter. Galileo, for his effort, is also tortured. Excuse me, not tortured. He was not tortured. He was pretty much abused by the Catholic Church. And he was later forced to recant and say all this stuff was a lie. Isaac Newton comes along. He's our physicist developing laws of gravity and motion. And then William Harvey comes along to develop to really understand the circulation of the blood and describe the nature of the heart valve, and understanding the heart is one giant pump. So those are your scientists: 3 astronomers, 1 physicist, 1 doctor. On to our absolute monarchs. This is the key type of government we see in Europe during this age. And the characteristics that always define these absolute monarchs. A centralization of power. When we talk about centralization of power, the key word there is central. What they're doing, these monarchs are centralizing the power amongst themselves. They're not really dividing up power. They're not delegating power. They are the power. They make all the decisions. Also, what we see with the absolute monarchs during this time is divine right. They believe that they get their power from God. And because they get their power from God, they don't have to answer to anybody. The 2 key absolute monarchs you need to know are Louis XIV and Peter the Great. Louis XIV is the King of France, who's also known as the Sun King. One of his big famous quotes that's attributed to him, he said, "I am the state," or "the state, it is I." And a key symbol of his power is the Palace of Versailles. This massive mammoth palace that he had built in France. And he forced his nobility to come and live with him during portions of the year to have greater control over them. Peter the Great, he is the king of Russia. The big key thing you need to remember with Peter the Great is westernization. And the key word there is western. He was trying to make Russia and the Russian people more similar to the Western European countries, because Russia was still very backwards at that time. Part of this great westernization effort is he's moving the capital. It was originally at Moscow, and he is moving it to St. Petersburg to be closer to the west and be on a port to have better access to the Western nations. So those are your 2 great absolute monarchs. Moving on to more English history, we have the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. They're very closely related. The English people, they had very early rights going way back to the Magna Carta. English nobility and even the common people had the right to a trial by jury. The Magna Carta had established rights for the nobility, and common law had established rights for the nobility and the commoners. But they started coming into conflict with Charles I. His big deal, he wanted to be an absolute monarch, kind of like Louis XIV and Peter the Great, which is a problem. They had limitations on the English monarchs ever since the Magna Carta. Well, he wanted to get rid of that. He was trying to get rid of the trial by jury. He wanted to dissolve Parliament. He wanted to be able to tax the English people anytime he wanted. And what this desire to be an absolute monarch would ultimately lead to was the English Civil War. And the two sides of the English Civil War, you have Charles, of course, and his supporters, and he's in charge of them. On the other side, you have Oliver Cromwell, who is leading the forces of Parliament. Ultimately, Charles is going to lose. Charles and his royal supporters are going to be defeated by the English Civil War. In fact, they captured Charles, they put him on trial, and they executed him, which was the first time anybody had ever done that to a sitting monarch. So that was a big deal. And the ironic thing is, after they got rid of him, Oliver Cromwell takes over. He seizes power, and he rules as a military dictator. And then even more ironically, after his death, so Oliver Cromwell's out of the situation, England goes right back to monarchy. They invite Charles II, the son of the king who they just executed. They invite him back to rule, and this is known as the English Restoration. They're restoring their monarchy. Well, nothing good came from that. Charles II ruled, and then his son James II ruled. Both of them tried as best they could to rule as absolute monarchs, just like Charles I tried to. Not only did they try to rule as absolute monarchs, the other problem is both of them are Catholic rulers, and England is very Protestant, and they don't want to switch back to Catholicism. So what we saw England breaking down into, again, it looked like it was going to be the Second English Civil War, with two sides developing. You had King James II and his supporters in Parliament were called the Tories, and you had the opposition forces who supported Parliament compared to King James, and their party was known as the Whigs. And the two of these are actually the first development of political parties in England. Well, ultimately they managed to avoid civil war. They invited, leaders in the Whigs invited King William and Queen Mary. William, by the way, is the Dutch king, the king of the Netherlands. And Mary is the daughter of King James II. However, she's acceptable to the English people because she's Protestant. They invite the pair of them to invade, which they do in 1688. They invade, and James is so scared that he flees. There's no fighting. This would have been a war had James not fled. Because he fled, and there was no bloodshed, it was a bloodless transfer of power. That's why they call this the Glorious Revolution. No blood involved. After William and Mary take over in 1688, they develop a constitutional monarchy. They sign off on this new type of government, where they are still a monarchy, or basically the monarchs, the kings and queens of England after them, and including them, will have very little power, more ceremonial than anything else. And what this leads to, this constitutional monarchy, it leads to new rights. It leads to the development of the Bill of Rights, trial by jury, which they still had back in the day, but this is really going to enshrine it, make it permanent. And also habeas corpus, which is the freedom from unfair imprisonment. So you couldn't just be thrown in prison without due process. So that's a little bit of English history. Moving on, what else is happening during the time is the Enlightenment. This is think of it as applying the ideas of the scientific revolution to the, particularly reason, to the world of man. We also see it defined by religious tolerance, not all the religious hatred of the Reformation period. And these ideas that come out of all these writers from the Enlightenment, they're going to fuel democratic revolutions, particularly all throughout the Americas and then in France. Big writers you need to know: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Charles Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire. You need to know their books and their key ideas. With Thomas Hobbes, he wrote Leviathan, and his big idea you need to remember is that he said man without very powerful government would exist in a state of nature, which is basically anarchy, where might makes right. John Locke, he writes 2 treatises on government. His big concept is that government exists to protect natural rights, these rights that people are natural to them. Life, liberty, property, these are the things that people have and that government exists to protect. Charles Montesquieu, he writes The Spirit of the Laws. He's the one who comes up with the idea of separation of powers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes The Social Contract. He says government is a contract between the rulers and the people, and when the rulers break the contract, the people have the right to revolt. And finally, Voltaire, he's big into religious tolerance, and along the religious lines, he says that the best form of government would include separation of church and state. All these Enlightenment ideas were very big in influencing the United States and their own development. We don't spend much time talking about that because you'll spend a lot more time on that in U.S. history and in government class in the coming years. The big things you need to know, the Enlightenment, it not only led to the the Revolution in America, it led to Thomas Jefferson and his writing the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of these ideas you will also see in the U.S. Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. One of the last big events in this chapter is the French Revolution, also caused by all these Enlightenment ideas. And by the way, when I say Americas back here, it's not just affecting the American Revolution. You'll see this in Chapter 7. It's influencing a greater number of revolutions all throughout the North and South America. But the French Revolution, it's being spurred on by all these Enlightenment ideas, just like the American Revolution. But they are also encouraged by the success of the American Revolution. Because the Americans were able to defeat the British, this is encouraging the French to believe they can as well. They can defeat their own monarchy. Two key events that you need to know. The beginning event is the storming of the Bastille, which happens on July 14, 1789. The Bastille was a political prison in Paris that a mob stormed, and it's considered widely the beginning of the French Revolution. One of the scariest periods of the French Revolution is the Reign of Terror, when the mob of Paris is executing thousands and thousands of Frenchmen and women by guillotine, the new device of execution, accusing them of being traitors to the new French government. Ultimately, the big outcomes you know from the French Revolution, it ended the monarchy of Louis XVI, and we also see it led to the rise of Napoleon. He is the Napoleon Bonaparte. He is the figure that ends the French Revolution and creates his own military dictatorship. So in many ways, he is very similar to Oliver Cromwell. The two of them are very similar in the ways that they rose to power. We'll see more about Napoleon in Chapter 8. In our last little bit, lots more people remember the Age of Reason. You have two musical composers you need to know, Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. When you think Bach, think Baroque. That's his style of music. He is a Baroque composer. And when you think of Baroque music, it's very complex, it's very showy, it's meant to impress you. Compared to Mozart, who is a classical composer, and classical compositions are more moderate and balanced compared to Baroque compositions. Voltaire, we already saw him. He was one of our Enlightenment writers. He was also a philosopher advocating the philosophy of rationalism, which is emphasizing reason and logic over faith. Eugene Delacroix is a painter you need to know. He's big into the Romantic school of art. And popular styles of painting during this time included classical pieces. When we say classical, don't think classical like the music compared classical. Think art depicting images of usually related to Greek and Roman mythology or history. Public events were also very popular. Nature scenes and portraits were big styles of art. A writer you need to know, Miguel de Cervantes, he wrote Don Quixote, which is considered to be the first novel, very important. And then a few new technologies are coming out. Technologies that are specifically improving trade and transportation. All-weather roads, that's key for transportation. New farm tools, including the wheel plow and the seed drill, are going to help increase agriculture. That's even referred to as the agricultural revolution. They're helping with trade items. And the new ship designs are going to help both of these. It's going to allow them to ships to survive at sea. So that's Chapter 6. Lots of people here. Let me in fact circle them because there's so many that you might want to remember. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Harvey. Then we have Louis, we have Peter, we have Charles. Here he is again. Oliver Cromwell. We have Charles II, James II, William and Mary. Kind of think of them together. Over here we have Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire. We saw Napoleon for a minute. We have Bach, Mozart, Voltaire again, Delacroix, Cervantes. So we have lots and lots of people. They're one of the biggest things to remember in this chapter. So, good luck, and make sure you study. I'll see you later.